The wind came first, a low moan across the vast, white emptiness of Willow Flats. It was a sound born in the mountains miles away, a lonely sound that gathered teeth as it swept over the plains. Then came the snow, not in gentle flakes, but in a hard, horizontal spray of ice that scoured the land. The year was 1886, and the first blizzard of the season had arrived with the temper of a hangman. At the Boone Ranch, the world had shrunk to the groan of timber and the violent flapping of a loose shutter against the main house. The very air tasted of frozen iron and pine. Elias Boone felt the cold in his bones, a deep, familiar ache that settled in the marrow. He leaned his shoulder into the great barn door, his boots slipping on the slick. Snow covered ground until he found purchase. The wind fought him, a solid wall of force trying to push its way into the warmth he had built. He grunted, a plume of white vapor erupting from his lips and vanishing instantly. The door scraped shut, and the sudden quiet was a mercy. It was not silence, but a muffling of the storm's fury, replaced by the soft sounds of his cattle. They shifted and snorted in their stalls, their large bodies radiating a damp, animal heat that filled the cavernous space. The air smelled of hay, manure, and warm milk, the scent of his life. He pulled off a leather glove, its palm worn through and the fingers split at the seams. His knuckles were raw, the skin cracked and angry red. He flexed his hand, trying to work feeling back into the numb digits. Each breath he took was a sharp pain in his lungs, the frozen air burning its way down. Outside, the rest of his herd huddled against the lee side of the barn, their heads low, their coats already thick with a crust of driven snow. He had gotten most of them in. Most. That would have to be enough. A man could not fight a plains blizzard. He could only endure it. Elias moved down the line of stalls, his footsteps heavy on the straw-strewn floor. He ran a hand over the flank of a young heifer, her hide trembling slightly. He murmured to them, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be one of the barn's own sounds. They were all he had left of his father, this land and these animals. They were his anchor in a world that seemed determined to blow him away. The wind howled outside the thick walls, rattling the roof, and Elias felt a pang of a solitude so profound it was like a physical weight on his chest. It was a flicker of movement near the creek that caught his eye through a grimy pane of glass in the barn wall. He squinted, wiping at the condensation with the heel of his hand. The snow was a blinding curtain, but for a moment it thinned, and he saw it clearly. A horse, a single sleigh, and a figure. They were stuck fast in Cotton Creek, right where the water ran swift under a treacherous skim of new ice. A fool's place to be in this weather, a dangerous fool. His first instinct was to turn away. He had his own to worry about. Trouble that drifted onto his land was not his to claim, but his father's voice echoed in his memory, plain as the day he last heard it. You do what is right, Elias, not what is easy. He sighed, the sound lost in the lowing of the cattle. He pulled his glove back on, the worn leather doing little to stop the cold. He grabbed a heavy coil of rope from a peg on the wall, its fibers stiff with frost. He walked to the stall of his own mount, a stout gelding named Amos, who watched him with intelligent, weary eyes. The horse did not need to be told. The set of Elias's jaw was enough. Outside the barn, the storm hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and blinding him with a swirl of white. He pulled his hat down low and swung into the saddle. Amos lowered his head and pushed into the wind, each step a deliberate, powerful effort. The snow was already deep, drifting against the fences, erasing the familiar contours of the land. The world was a chaotic blur of white and gray, and the only point of reference was the dark shape of the sleigh, a stricken vessel in a sea of ice. As he drew closer, he could see the scene more clearly. The horse hitched to the sleigh was panicked, its eyes wide as it strained against its harness, its hooves finding no traction on the slick ice. The sleigh itself was tilted at a frightening angle, one runner having broken through the surface and lodged itself in the muddy creek bed below. A woman was struggling with the horse, her voice a thin thread of sound snatched away by the gale. A small wooden chest with a brass cross painted on its side rattled precariously on the seat of the sleigh. He brought Amos to a halt, a safe distance from the fragile edge of the ice. The woman turned, and he saw her face for the first time. It was pale with cold, framed by a dark wool scarf, but her eyes were sharp and resolute. She was not a girl. She was a woman grown, and there was no hysterics in her, only a fierce, frustrated determination. Nora Dale saw the rider emerge from the swirling snow like a ghost of the plains. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, his face weathered and hard beneath the brim of his hat. He moved with a quiet competence that was somehow reassuring in the midst of the storm's chaos. Her horse, Samuel, shied away from the newcomer, and she put a steadying hand on its neck, speaking to it in a low, calming tone. Her medicine chest, filled with precious bottles of laudanum, carbolic acid, and neatly rolled bandages, slid another inch toward the edge of the seat. If she lost that, her entire purpose for being in this God-forsaken territory would be lost with it. Elias dismounted, the rope held ready in his hand. He did not speak. There was no need for pleasantries in a blizzard. Words were for warm rooms and firesides. Out here, there was only action. He expertly fashioned a loop and tossed it, the rope sailing through the wind and landing squarely over the front axle of the sleigh. He gave it a sharp tug to secure it. The ice around the sleigh groaned in protest, a spiderweb of cracks spreading out from where the runner had broken through. The horse whinnied, a high, terrified sound. Nora watched him, her hands numb, her body shaking from a cold that had seeped deep inside her. She had been pushing and pulling for the better part of an hour, her strength giving out, her hope starting to freeze along with her extremities. This man was her last chance. She pushed a strand of dark hair, stiff with ice, from her face. Her voice was raspy from the cold air, but it carried over the wind. "I will warm the bed. You deal with the cold." The words left her lips before she had fully thought them through. It was a simple, practical statement, an allocation of tasks. She saw her job as getting to shelter, getting a fire started, creating warmth. His job, with the horse and rope, was the brute force in the freezing wind. It was a partnership born of necessity. Elias stopped his work for a beat. He looked up at her, his eyes unreadable in the blowing snow. Then, the corner of his mouth lifted in a slow, almost imperceptible smirk. It was a tired, cynical expression, the look of a man who had heard all manner of strange things from people in desperate situations. He clearly thought it was a joke, or worse, a strange, forward proposition from a woman stranded in a storm. He had lived alone for so long that the idea of a woman offering warmth was something from a saloon story, not from real life. He gave a single, disbelieving shake of his head and turned back to his work, wrapping the end of the rope around his saddle horn. He did not see the curtain twitch in the window of the Willow Flat Saloon, a quarter-mile down the snow-swept road. But inside, Bartholomew Higgins, a man whose business was other people's business, lowered the lace and turned to the room. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, wet wool, and cheap tobacco. "Well now, fellas," he said, his voice carrying across the low murmur of the bar. "It seems the new teacher nurse has found herself in a spot of trouble, and it looks like Elias Boone is her savior." A few men grunted, uninterested, but Josiah, a wiry man with a face full of suspicion, leaned forward. "What of it? Boone helps folks. It is what Boones do." Bartholomew smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "Oh, he is helping all right. And she just made him an offer for his troubles. Heard it clear as day on the wind. She told him she would warm his bed if he dealt with the cold for her." A sudden silence fell over the tables. The men looked at each other. A low chuckle started from a corner, then grew into a wave of coarse laughter. The words, stripped of their context and urgency, twisted into something else entirely in the hot, stagnant air of the saloon. They became a joke, a piece of scandalous gossip to be passed around, embellished and savored through the long, cold night. The lonely rancher and the new woman. The story wrote itself. Back at the creek, Elias was oblivious to the tale being woven about him. He clicked his tongue, and Amos leaned into the strain. The rope went taut, humming with tension. Leather creaked. The gelding dug its powerful hooves into the snow-packed earth, muscles bunching in its haunches. For a moment, nothing happened. The sleigh remained firmly wedged. Then, with a sound like a pistol shot, the ice shattered. The sleigh lurched violently, water and shards of ice flying into the air. It scraped against the creek bottom, and then, with a final groan of protesting wood, it slid up onto the snowy bank. Free! Nora stumbled back, her knees weak with relief. The sudden release of tension was as exhausting as the struggle itself. She grabbed for the medicine chest, her frozen fingers clumsy on the wood, and hugged it to her chest. Now that the immediate danger was past, the cold she had been fighting off descended with a vengeance. A violent shiver racked her body, so powerful it made her teeth click together audibly. She was still standing, but only just. Elias dismounted and walked toward her, coiling the rope as he came. The cynical smirk was gone, replaced by a look of grim concern. He could see the blue tint to her lips, the uncontrollable trembling of her frame. Words were still useless things. He moved past her to his horse, unstrapped the heavy wool blanket from behind his saddle, and without a word, swung it around her shoulders. The blanket was coarse and heavy, and it carried the strong, earthy smell of horse sweat, damp wool, and the faint, clean scent of the cold itself. It was not a pleasant smell, but it was a smell of life, of work, of substance. It was an honest smell. As he pulled the edges of the blanket together in front of her, his calloused, cracked knuckles brushed against her chin. The touch was brief, accidental, but it was the first human contact she had felt in days, and it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. The scent of him, of his animal and his labor, enveloped her. In that moment, wrapped in the heavy, smelly wool, a strange and unexpected feeling bloomed in her chest. It was warmth, not the warmth of a fire, but a deeper, more primal heat. It was a premonition, a fleeting promise that even in the heart of the most brutal cold, a different kind of warmth might be found. Elias met her gaze for only a second, his expression unreadable as ever, before turning to unhitch her exhausted horse from the sleigh. The storm raged around them, but for a brief instant, it felt as though they stood in the quiet eye of it all. The Boone granary, once a place of dusty silence, now hummed with a fragile life. Nora Dale had transformed it. She had swept the floors clean of chaff, arranged hay bales into makeshift benches, and nailed a large, smoothed piece of slate to one of the walls. Light filtered through the gaps in the timbers, illuminating dust motes that danced in the cold air. It was not a proper schoolhouse, but it was a haven. Outside, Willow Flats lay buried under a thick blanket of ice and snow, the world silenced and scoured by the wind. Inside, there was the scratch of chalk, the murmur of children sounding out their letters, and the smell of hot, cinnamon-laced porridge. Nora moved between the half-dozen children, her presence a quiet source of warmth. She knelt beside little Thomas, whose small hand struggled to form a letter B, gently guiding his fingers. She paused to wipe young Mary's runny nose with a soft cloth before it could drip onto her primer. These were the children of the few families who scratched a living from the unforgiving land around the town, their faces chapped red by the wind, their clothes patched and worn. In their eyes, Nora saw a flicker of hope that the town itself seemed to have lost. She had ladled porridge into their bowls an hour earlier, watching them eat with a ravenous hunger that spoke of lean times. This was more than a school. It was a pocket of resistance against the cold, a declaration that life would go on, while Nora nurtured the future. Elias Boone was taking stock of the present. He stood in the quiet cold of his barn, a ledger in one hand and a piece of charcoal in the other. He moved from stall to stall, his gaze sweeping over his herd. Each animal was a living, breathing calculation. He counted their ribs, assessed the gloss of their coats, and measured their strength against the long winter still to come. His breath plumed in the frigid air as he made marks in his ledger. Then he moved to the hayloft, his boots sinking into the sweet-smelling fodder. He counted the bales, his lips moving silently. So many bales, so many cattle, so many days until the spring thaw. The numbers swam in his head, a relentless arithmetic of survival. He slid down the ladder and walked to a small, cluttered desk he had built into the wall of the tack room. He opened the ledger. The page was filled with his father's precise, steady script, and then his own, which was heavier, more hurried. At the bottom of the page was the final, damning tally. The loan from Thayer and Company, due at the end of the month. The amount was not impossibly large, but with cattle prices low and the blizzard making a trip to a larger market impossible. It might as well have been a king's ransom. The debt felt like a physical weight, a block of ice pressing down on him, colder than any storm. A shadow fell across the barn door, and Elias looked up, his hand instinctively going to his side, where a pistol would normally hang. Colton Thayer stood silhouetted against the bright, glaring snow. He was dressed in a fine wool coat that had never seen a day of real work, his boots polished to a high shine. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of bay rum and money. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "A hard winter, Boone," Thayer said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "A man needs to be practical in times like these." He walked past Elias, running a gloved hand over the thick timber of a stall as if assessing its value. "I was just looking at your property map down at the registrar's office. Your southern pasture runs right along the proposed railroad spur. Very valuable." Elias said nothing. He stood by his desk, a silent, immovable object. Thayer turned, his smile widening. "I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to make you a generous offer. Sell me the southern half of your land. I will forgive the entire debt, and even add a little extra for your trouble. Think of it. No more sleepless nights counting hay bales. The bed will be warm all year round." The final words hung in the cold air. A deliberate, poisoned dart. Thayer knew about the rumor. Of course he knew. He had likely started it. The reference to the bed was a crude, humiliating jab, meant to unbalance him, to remind him of his isolation and the town's contempt. Elias felt a hot surge of anger, a stark contrast to the barn's chill. He looked at Thayer's smug face and thought of his father, of the sweat and blood that had been poured into this land. He thought of the woman in the granary, trying to build something good in the middle of all this cold. His hand closed around the object on his desk. It was his father's seal, a heavy piece of brass with the family's initial, a B with a distinctive, broken crossbar carved into its base. It was a symbol of his legacy, his identity. "No," Elias said. The single word was flat and hard. It dropped into the silence like a stone. Thayer's smile finally faltered. He looked at Elias, a flicker of genuine annoyance in his eyes. "Do not be a fool. This land is cursed. Your father died working it. Your brother died on it. Do not let your pride be the death of you, too." "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice low and steady. Thayer held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a short, dismissive laugh. "As you wish. The cold has a way of making a man see reason. The offer stands. For now." He turned and walked out, his polished boots leaving clean, sharp prints in the snow. Elias watched him go, his hand gripping the brass seal so tightly the edges bit into his palm. The rumor Thayer had so casually weaponized had spread through Willow Flats like a fever. In the saloon, it was a source of endless amusement. The cold that seeped through the walls was forgotten in the heat of speculation and crude jokes. Men who had known Elias his whole life now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt when he rode into town for supplies. They saw him as a fool. A lonely man so desperate for a woman's touch that he was letting the new teacher nurse wrap him around her little finger. They whispered as Nora walked past, their words just loud enough for her to hear. The phrase warm bed followed her like a stray dog, sometimes in a snicker, sometimes in a lewd suggestion. The cold of the town's judgment was, in its own way, as bitter as the wind. Nora held her head high, her expression unreadable, but the words stung, leaving small, invisible welts on her spirit. A few days later, the coal bin at the granary was running low. Nora harnessed her horse to the now-repaired sleigh and made the trip to Thayer's fuel and supply warehouse, a large, drafty building on the edge of town. A hulking, silent man named Jebediah worked for Thayer, his face perpetually smudged with soot. He grunted a greeting and began to shovel lump coal into a large burlap sack set upon a hanging scale. Nora watched him closely. She was used to making every dollar stretch, to accounting for every ounce of medicine and every spoonful of flour. She noticed the way he stopped shoveling just before the needle on the scale reached the mark she had paid for. It was short, not by much, but by enough. It was short by at least half a shovel's worth. "It is light," she said, her voice clear and firm. Jebediah stopped and turned his head slowly, giving her a look of dull surprise, as if no one had ever questioned his measure before. "It is what it is," he grumbled. "Put another shovel on," she insisted. He hesitated, then glanced toward the office where Thayer was visible through the window. With a sigh of irritation, he scooped up another half shovel of coal and dumped it in the sack. As he bent down, Nora's eyes were drawn to his boots. They were caked in grime, but it was not the usual black dust of the coal yard. There were strange, reddish streaks in the soot, the color of rust or dried blood. She had seen that color once before, on a geological survey map of the county. The abandoned northern mines, the ones up in the hills, were known for a particular vein of coal that left a distinctive red dust. It was considered inferior, full of sulfur, but Thayer was selling it as premium grade from the southern pits. She said nothing more. She paid the man, loaded the heavy sack onto her sleigh, and guided her horse back toward the Boone Ranch. But she did not forget the short measure, the red dust on the boots. They were small, seemingly unconnected facts, but in Nora's orderly mind, they clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. It was cheating, plain and simple, a small injustice, but it felt like a piece of a much larger, uglier puzzle. That night, the wind died down, and a heavy, listening silence fell over the ranch. The moon was a sliver of ice in a black sky. Elias's dog, a grizzled old hound named Buck, began to bark from under the porch, a low, guttural warning that raised the hairs on Elias's arms. Something was wrong. Then came another sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping, followed by the faint rattle of a window pane in the tack room. It was a sound that did not belong to the night. Elias was out of his chair in an instant, his body moving with a fluid economy of motion. He reached above the hearth and took down the heavy flintlock rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. It was an old weapon, but he kept it clean and loaded. In a world where the law was a day's ride away, a man's first line of defense was his own. The sound from the yard came again, sharper this time, a tearing, slashing noise. Nora appeared in the doorway of her small room, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She had heard it too. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her face was calm. "What is it?" she whispered. "Stay here," Elias commanded, his voice a low growl. But she did not move. Instead, she turned and picked up the hurricane lamp from the main table. She struck a match, the flare of light briefly illuminating the determination in her eyes, and lit the wick. She adjusted the flame until it burned with a steady, clean light. She was not a woman who hid. She held the lamp up. Elias looked at her, at the steady flame she held, and he gave a curt nod. He moved to the door and eased it open, the rifle held ready at his shoulder. The cold night air flooded the room. Nora followed a step behind him, holding the lamp high. The circle of light cast by the lamp cut a swath through the darkness, falling upon a scene of quiet violation. 3 of the large canvas-covered hay bales he had stacked near the barn had been slashed open, their contents spilling out onto the snow, where they would be ruined by morning. It was a vicious, wasteful act, an attack aimed directly at his ability to survive the winter. There was no one in sight. Whoever had done it was gone, vanished back into the shadows. Elias swept the yard with the rifle, his eyes probing the darkness beyond the lamplight. Nora held the lamp steady, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. The light cast their 2 shadows long and stark against the snow-covered ground. One shadow was broad and armed, a guardian. The other was slender but unwavering, a beacon. They stood together in the vast, cold darkness, 2 figures against the encroaching night, their shadows joined as one. The slashed hay was a wound in the snow. Elias stood over the violation, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the hot anger in his gut. This was more than waste. It was a message, written in destruction. The clean, sweet scent of the ruined fodder rose in the still air, and with it came another smell, a ghost from a different night, the phantom scent of smoke. It coiled in his memory, thick and acrid, and suddenly he was no longer standing in the frozen yard of 1886. He was 3 years back, breathing fire. The world had been red and screaming. The old cattle barn, the one his grandfather had raised, was a roaring furnace against the black sky. The terrified bellowing of the cattle was a sound from hell. He had gotten most of them out, his lungs raw, his eyes streaming. But his younger brother, Samuel, had gone back in for a calf trapped in its pen. A fool thing to do. A brave thing. The main beam, a timber as old as the Boone name on this land, groaned, sagged, and gave way. Elias saw it. The moment stretched, time thinning to a sharp, clear line. Samuel, his face black with soot, looking up, the shower of sparks, the collapsing roof. Elias had lunged, not thinking, only moving. He grabbed Samuel's coat, pulling him back from the collapsing wall of fire. He felt a searing, unbelievable pain in his right hand. A falling rafter, wreathed in flame, had crashed down where he had just been, grazing his hand as it fell. The smell of burning pine was drowned out by a new, sicklier scent. The smell of his own scorched skin. He had dragged Samuel clear, but the great beam had already done its work. The damage was inside. Samuel had coughed once, a gout of black smoke and blood, and then he was still. He had died right there on the singed earth, the heat of the fire on one side, the cold of the night on the other. Elias remembered kneeling beside him, the back of his own hand a blistering ruin, and feeling nothing but a profound, hollowing cold. The town doctor had called it lung damage from the smoke, but the whispers in the saloon and over the church pews had a different name for it. It was the Boone curse. Bad luck clung to that family like frost. The land carried a coldness that eventually claimed everyone who worked it. The rumor became a truth in the small mines of Willow Flats. It followed Elias into the general store. It sat with him in the church, a constant, unseen companion at every meal. The scar on the back of his hand, a puckered, discolored patch of skin, was a visible reminder of the brand the town had placed on his soul. The sharp scent of pine from the nearby woods snapped Elias back to the present. He looked down at the slashed hay, then at his scarred hand, flexing his fingers. The memory was always there, just beneath the surface, a cold spot that never warmed. Nora watched him, the lamplight flickering across the hard lines of his face. She saw him stare at his hand, saw the darkness that passed through his eyes. She knew the look of a man haunted by something more than the immediate threat. It was a look she had seen before, in her own mirror. Her own ghosts did not smell of smoke, but of betrayal and cheap perfume. She had been engaged once to a man named Deputy Miller. He was handsome, ambitious, and respected in the small Ohio town where she had grown up. He spoke of justice and community, and she had believed him. Their future had seemed as straight and clear as the church aisle she planned to walk down. Then she had found the letters. They were tucked away in his desk drawer. Letters from Colton Thayer, a man she knew only as a shrewd land speculator. The letters laid out a simple, rotten scheme. Thayer would place a lien on the church property, citing a forgotten and likely fraudulent debt. Miller, in his official capacity, would fail to file the proper paperwork to contest it, allowing Thayer to seize the land for pennies on the dollar. Miller's share would be a handsome plot on the new town expansion. She had confronted him. He did not deny it. He had laughed, had called her naive. This is how the world works. Nora, he had told her, his handsome face twisting into something ugly. You either take your piece or you get trampled. She had looked at the man she was supposed to marry and saw a stranger, a hollow space where a conscience should have been. She had taken off his ring, placed it on top of the letters, and walked out. She never saw him again. The cost of that silence, of the town's willingness to look the other way, was the church land. Her own cost was a shattered future. She had left Ohio, had gone to study medicine in the raw, unforgiving hospitals of the city, treating the kinds of wounds that could not be hidden. She became a field nurse, volunteering for the frontier, for places like Willow Flats. She ran toward the quiet desperation, because she understood it. She knew the price of letting a small rottenness fester. It never stayed small. It grew, and it consumed everything. A new scent cut through the cold air, sharp and chemical. It pricked at her senses. It was the smell of rock oil, thin and greasy on the wind. It was coming from the hay shed. "Elias," she said, her voice tight with alarm. She pointed with the lamp. A flicker of orange, small and hungry, was climbing the dry timbers of the shed wall. Fire. The word was a spark, and Elias exploded into motion. The ghosts of the past vanished, replaced by the raw, immediate terror of the present. He sprinted for the water trough near the barn. Grabbing 2 empty buckets as he ran, it was frozen solid. Without hesitating, he slammed a bucket down on the ice, breaking the surface, and began scooping up bucketfuls of slush and snow. Nora did not scream or stand helpless. She set the lamp down in a clear patch of snow and ran for the barn. She remembered seeing a large, heavy canvas tarp, thick with oil and dust, draped over a broken wagon. It was heavy, but she dragged it out, her muscles straining. The flames were growing, feeding on the dry wood and the hay inside, turning from orange to a roaring yellow. The sight sent a spike of pure ice into Elias's heart. Not again. He would not watch it all burn again. He hurled the first bucket of snow at the base of the fire. It hissed, and a cloud of thick, black smoke billowed into the sky, but the flames barely faltered. Nora arrived, dragging the tarp behind her. Together she yelled over the growing roar. He understood immediately. He dropped the buckets and grabbed one end of the heavy canvas. They ran toward the shed, the heat pushing against them like a physical force. On a count of 3, they swung the tarp up and over the burning section of the wall, a desperate attempt to smother the fire, to starve it of the air it craved. The canvas immediately began to smolder. They pushed against it, using their bodies to seal it against the wall, trapping the smoke and heat. For a long minute, they stood there, pressing against the hot, shuddering canvas. Smoke seeped out around the edges, thick and black, stinging their eyes and catching in their throats. It coated their hair and faces with a greasy film. Finally, the roaring sound began to subside, replaced by a sullen crackling. Elias grabbed the buckets again, and they spent the next 10 minutes dousing the smoldering timbers with snow and icy water until the last ember was extinguished. They stood back, panting, their chests heaving. The side of the shed was a blackened, ugly scar. The smell of wet soot and burned hay was overwhelming. But it was standing. The fire was out. "Something is not right," Elias said, his voice raspy. He pointed to the shed door, a few feet from the scorched wall. The latch was hanging loose. He walked over and touched it. The thick iron staple that held it to the door frame had been sawn clean through. The cut was neat, the metal shavings still bright on the snow below. This was the work of a professional hand, done quickly and quietly. "They meant for the whole thing to go up," Nora whispered, staring at the clean cut. "They slashed the bales to get you out here. When that did not cause enough trouble, they set the fire." Elias knelt, his eyes scanning the ground near the door. There, snagged on the splintered end of the sawn staple, was a small scrap of fabric. He plucked it free. It was a piece of coarse, heavy wool, the kind used for miners' coats. It was dark with grime, but on one side, it was stained with a familiar, telltale dust, the same reddish dust Nora had seen on the boots of Thayer's man. Elias looked at the fabric in his palm, then at the sawn latch, then at the blackened wall. The pieces were no longer separate. They were a chain, each link forged by the same hand. This was not a curse. It was not bad luck. It was an attack. Nora came to stand beside him. Her gaze fell on his right hand, where he held the scrap of cloth. The scar on the back of his hand stood out pale against his soot-stained skin. She saw the tremor in his fingers, the memory of that other fire burning in his eyes. "This is not God's cold," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. It was a statement of fact, an absolution. This was the cold of men, the cold of greed. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of 3 years of blame and suspicion pressing down on him. When he opened them, he was still looking at the scar. It was a map of his grief, a brand of his failure. Nora saw the depth of the pain in that look. Without a word, she unwound the simple woolen scarf from her neck. It was warm from her own body heat. Gently, she reached out and laid it over his hand, covering the scrap of cloth, covering the old, cold scar. The soft, living warmth of the wool settled over his skin. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It did not erase the memory, but it pressed down upon it, a quiet, steady warmth against a long and bitter chill. The scrap of wool was their compass. After smothering the last of the embers and ensuring the shed would not reignite, Elias had made a decision. Waiting for morning was waiting for the enemy to choose the next point of attack. The moon was high enough, and the snow on the ground cast a pale, ghostly light. It was enough to see by. He saddled Amos, his movements economical and grim. He did not ask Nora to stay behind. He did not need to. She had already retrieved her heavy coat and was wrapping a thick scarf around her neck, her jaw set with the same hard resolve he felt in his own chest. She would see this through. They would see this through. He held the scrap of fabric. The red dust was a stain of guilt, a signpost. It was their only lead. He rode Amos and Nora rode her sturdy gelding. Samuel, they moved out from the relative safety of the ranch yard into the vast, silent wilderness of the plains. There was no clear trail of footprints. The wind and the fresh falling snow had seen to that. But Elias was not looking for a trail. He was looking for a destination. The red dust came from the northern mines. To get there from his ranch, a man would take the fastest route, the path that cut across the creek, Cotton Creek, and the only place to cross it for miles in either direction was the old wooden bridge. They rode in silence. The only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the soft, rhythmic crunch of their horses' hooves in the deep snow. The world was a study in black and white, the dark, skeletal shapes of winter-stripped aspens stark against the luminous snowfields. Elias scanned the landscape, his eyes missing nothing. He was a part of this land, and he could read its moods, its secrets. Tonight, it felt tense, watchful. A predator was hiding in the shadows. Nora rode beside him, her medicine bag tied securely to her saddle. She was not a fighter, but she was no stranger to crisis. She had learned to keep her fear on a tight leash, to think clearly when chaos erupted. She trusted Elias. She trusted the quiet competence in the set of his shoulders, the way he moved as if he were an extension of the horse beneath him. She watched his hands on the reins, the scarred one and the whole one, and felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She was not alone in this. They saw the bridge ahead, a dark line bisecting the white ribbon of the frozen creek. It was a simple structure, a wooden span suspended by thick ropes tied to massive anchor posts on either bank. Cotton Creek was narrow here, but deep, its current a black, churning force beneath a fragile lid of ice. As they drew closer, Elias reined in Amos, holding up a hand. "Wait," he breathed, the word a puff of white vapor. He dismounted, moving with a hunter's stealth. Nora did the same. He pointed to the ground at the foot of the bridge. There, sheltered from the wind by a thicket of pine, were footprints, several sets of them, and in the moonlight, they could clearly see the faint, rust-colored dusting of coal that had fallen from the men's boots. They had found the trail. Elias drew the heavy pistol from his belt. The click of the hammer being pulled back was unnaturally loud in the silence. He motioned for Nora to stay with the horses, to keep to the shadows of the trees. He started toward the bridge, his steps slow and deliberate, the pistol held ready. The air grew thick with anticipation. Then, the world exploded. A torch flared to life from the dense cluster of pines on the far side of the bridge. Then another, and another. The sudden, violent eruption of light was blinding. Figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by scarves wrapped high against the cold. They were shadows given form by the flickering firelight. 3 of them. 4. Elias saw the long, dark shape of a rifle being raised. A shot cracked through the night. The sound, a whip of thunder. The bullet splintered the wooden railing inches from Elias's head. He dove for cover behind one of the thick anchor posts, the snow cold and wet against his face. Another shot rang out, then a third. The horses whinnied in terror, pulling at their reins. They had been led into a trap. Elias peered around the edge of the post. The men were advancing onto the bridge, their torches held high, their boots thudding on the wooden planks. They were trying to flank him, to pin him against the creek bank. He fired his pistol, the boom of the shot echoing his attackers. One of the men grunted and stumbled back, but was not badly hit. Elias was outnumbered, outgunned. They could not fight their way through. They could not retreat. His eyes darted around, assessing, calculating, the bridge, the ropes. A desperate idea, born of pure instinct, took root. He looked back at Nora, who was struggling to control the panicked horses. He pointed frantically at the thick anchor ropes on their side of the bank. "The ropes, cut them!" he yelled, his voice nearly lost in the noise. For a second, she stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion. Then, understanding dawned. She pulled a small, sharp surgical knife from a pocket in her coat. It was not an axe, but it would have to do. While Elias laid down covering fire, forcing the men on the bridge to take cover, Nora ran to the first of the thick, tarred ropes that held their side of the bridge aloft. She began to saw at it, the small blade biting into the tough fibers. It was slow, agonizing work. Her hands were already numb with cold, and the rope was as thick as her wrist. Splinters drove into her skin. Elias fired again, his last shot, the pistol now empty and useless. The men on the bridge, realizing he had to reload, surged forward again. One of them, a big man, bolder than the rest, made a running leap across the remaining few yards to their side of the bank. He landed heavily, his boots skidding in the snow, and charged directly at Nora. Elias roared, a sound of pure fury, and threw himself at the attacker. He dropped the useless pistol and met the man with his shoulder, a brutal, jarring impact that sent both of them sprawling into the snow. It was a close, ugly fight. The man was strong, his fists like hammers. He swung wildly, and Elias ducked under a blow that would have crushed his skull. Elias drove his own fist into the man's gut, knocking the wind out of him. Nora sawed frantically at the rope, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fibers were parting, one by one. A few more seconds. Elias and the big man were on their feet again, grappling in the snow. The man had a knife. Elias saw the glint of steel in the torchlight and twisted away, the blade slicing through the thick fabric of his coat. He grabbed the man's wrist, their arms locked in a contest of pure strength. The man brought up his other hand, which held the heavy butt of a pistol, and slammed it against the side of Elias's head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. Elias staggered back, his ears ringing, the coppery taste of blood in his mouth. He could feel a tooth loosen from the impact. The rope Nora was working on snapped with a loud crack, the frayed end whipping through the air. The bridge sagged violently to one side. The men still on it yelled in alarm, scrambling back toward the far bank. Back Elias bellowed at Nora, his voice a raw command. She did not hesitate. She ran to the second rope, her small knife ready. The big man, seeing his escape route failing, turned his fury on Elias. He raised the pistol butt again for a final, decisive blow. But Nora acted. She grabbed the hurricane lamp she had lit earlier and brought with them. Without thinking, she hurled it. The lamp sailed through the air in a perfect arc, shattering against the man's chest. Burning oil splashed across the man's front and onto the snow-covered ground. For a horrifying instant, he became a human torch, his scarf and coat igniting. He screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and blindly stumbled backward. Away from the flames, away from Elias. He fell through the broken railing of the lopsided bridge, plunging into the black, churning water below. The torch hissed and was extinguished, his screams swallowed by the current. The second rope snapped with a great groan of tortured wood. Their half of the bridge tore away from the bank and collapsed into the creek, leaving a gaping chasm of black water and grinding ice. The two remaining attackers on the far side stood frozen for a moment, their faces illuminated by their torches, then turned and melted back into the darkness of the trees. Silence descended, broken only by the panting breaths of Elias and Nora and the rushing of the creek. The immediate danger was gone, but the cold, the darkness, and the pain remained. Elias probed his mouth with his tongue, the loose tooth a dull, throbbing ache. Nora's wrist was scraped raw and bleeding where she had worked the knife. Lying in the snow near where the big man had fallen was a heavy leather satchel. Elias limped over and picked it up. It was heavy. He unbuckled the strap. Inside was a ledger, and stuffed alongside it were dozens of paper slips. He pulled one out and held it up to the light of the remaining torches on the far bank. It was a receipt for a coal delivery to the railroad, a delivery that had never been made. It was a phantom invoice, and at the bottom, pressed hard into the paper, was an ink stamp of a seal, Thayer and Company. "This is it," Nora breathed, staring at the paper. "This is the proof." They had won, but their victory had left them stranded, exhausted, and exposed. The ice on the creek, shattered by the collapse of the bridge, began to crack and shift under their feet. A long, groaning fissure raced across the surface near where they stood. "The woods," Elias said, his voice still hoarse. "Now." He grabbed the satchel, and Nora grabbed her medical bag. They scrambled up the bank, away from the treacherous ice, and plunged into the relative safety of the dense pine forest. They pushed their way through the heavy, snow-laden branches, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the broken bridge, deeper in the woods, sheltered from the wind. The silence was absolute. They finally stopped in a small clearing, their bodies shaking with cold and the aftermath of the fight. Elias took the heavy wool blanket from his saddle roll and, without a word, draped it over both their shoulders, pulling Nora close to share his body heat. She leaned against him, her head resting on his chest, utterly spent. She could hear the steady, strong beat of his heart under her ear. His arm was a solid weight around her, a shield against the night. They stood like that for a long time, two survivors huddled together in the immense, cold darkness. the warmth of the shared blanket, of their proximity, was a fragile but defiant ember against the vast wilderness. In the quiet of the forest, with the scent of pine and snow and blood in the air, Nora's words from their first meeting came back to him. "I will warm the bed. You deal with the cold." He had thought it was a joke then, a strange, forward comment from a desperate woman. He understood now. It had not been a joke. It was what she had just done. She had faced the fire, had fought beside him, had given him the warmth of her courage, and he, in turn, had dealt with the cold, the brutal, violent cold of Thayer's ambition. She must have been thinking the same thing. She tilted her head up, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "The bed is still not warm," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, but with a hint of a weary smile. Elias looked down at her. He reached up with his uninjured hand and gently brushed a dusting of snow from her hair. "I am still dealing with the cold," he replied, his voice a low rumble. It was no longer an arrangement of practicality. In the crucible of that night, on the edge of the broken bridge, the words had been forged into something new. It was a promise, a partnership, a quiet vow made in the heart of a shared winter. The church was the only building in Willow Flats that felt warm, not from the heat of its single pot-bellied stove, which fought a losing battle against the drafts, but from the press of human bodies. It was Sunday morning. The whole of the town, or what passed for it, was gathered on the hard-hewn wooden pews, their faces scrubbed clean, their voices a low, pious murmur. The air smelled of damp wool, melting snow, and the faint, sweet scent of hymn books. Light, filtered through tall, plain-glass windows, fell in pale stripes across the dusty floor. It was a house of God, but on the frontier it served a dual purpose. On Sunday it was a sanctuary. On weekdays, or whenever necessity demanded, it was a courthouse. And the man who stood at the pulpit, Reverend Avery, was both preacher and judge. Elias and Nora entered through the heavy oak doors, and a wave of silence rippled through the congregation. Every head turned, every eye fixed on them. They were not just Elias Boone, the quiet, cursed rancher, and Nora Dale, the new teacher. They were a story, a scandal, the subjects of a week's worth of whispers and speculation. Elias felt the weight of their stares like a physical burden. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. Beside him, Nora walked with a straight-backed dignity that defied the room's palpable curiosity. She looked neither to the left nor the right, her focus entirely on the man at the front of the room. Reverend Judge Avery was a tall, spare man with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too many hard winters. He finished his reading from the book of Job, his voice a dry rustle, and then closed the heavy Bible. He looked out over his flock, his gaze finally settling on Elias and Nora, who now stood before the pulpit. "Elias Boone, Miss Dale," he said, his tone neutral. "The Sabbath is a day of rest. I trust your business is urgent." "It is," Elias replied, his voice rough. He held up the heavy leather satchel they had taken from the bridge. "We have evidence of a crime, theft and conspiracy to commit fraud." A collective gasp went through the pews. This was better than any sermon. Elias placed the satchel on the altar, the frontier's witness stand, and opened it. He laid out the ledger and the stack of phantom coal receipts, each one stamped with the seal of Thayer and Company. "These are fraudulent invoices," Nora stated, her voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the small church. "Bills for coal never delivered to the railroad, used to create the appearance of debt." The judge picked up one of the slips, his brow furrowed. He looked from the paper to a figure sitting in the front pew. Colton Thayer had not moved. He watched the proceedings with an air of detached amusement, a faint, confident smile playing on his lips. "Mr. Thayer," the judge said, his voice laced with a new severity, "do you have a response to this accusation?" Thayer rose smoothly to his feet. He was, as always, impeccably dressed, a dark wool suit in a sea of homespun cotton and worn leather. He looked utterly at ease, as if this were a minor inconvenience, a delay in his morning schedule. A response? Why, of course. "Reverend," he said, his voice an oily balm of reason, "it seems there has been a simple misunderstanding, a clerical error. My man at the warehouse, Jebediah, is not the most literate of fellows. I am sure his books are in a dreadful state. I will have to speak to him about it." He gave a small, indulgent laugh, as if speaking of a mischievous child. "It is more than a mistake," Elias growled. "Your men attacked us. They tried to burn down my hay shed. One of them is dead in Cotton Creek." Thayer's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "A terrible tragedy," he said, shaking his head. "Desperate men do desperate things in this cold. Perhaps they were common bandits, hoping to steal what little you have." He then reached into his own coat pocket and produced a folded sheaf of papers. "His own evidence, but this is the matter at hand. Is it not the debt? My business with Mr. Boone is a simple financial one, entirely separate from these unfortunate and violent fantasies." He stepped forward and handed the papers to the judge. It was the original loan agreement signed by Elias a year prior, but as Judge Avery unfolded it, another page, freshly written in new ink, was attached. "I have taken the liberty of adding a standard winter provision fee," Thayer announced to the room. "Given the severity of the weather and the increased risk associated with the loan, it is a necessary precaution. It is all perfectly legal. The new total is, of course, due immediately." The judge stared at the paper, his face grim. The fee Thayer had added was exorbitant, effectively doubling the original debt. It was a predatory, outrageous sum. But Thayer was right about one thing. In the loose, half-formed legal structure of the territory, it was not strictly illegal. It was usury. But usury was a sin, not yet a crime. The hard proof of the phantom receipts was now muddied, transformed from a criminal matter into a civil dispute. A rancher's word against a banker's contract. Judge Avery was cornered, and he knew it. He was a man of God, but he was also a man of the law. Such as it was, his authority rested on a fragile balance. He could not be seen to favor one man over another without hard, irrefutable proof. "This court," he said, his voice heavy, "cannot rule on speculation and accusations. The matter of the receipts requires investigation. The matter of the contract is a civil one." He looked from Thayer's smug face to Elias's thunderous one. "I will grant a stay of 3 days. 3 days for you, Mr. Boone, to settle your debt with Mr. Thayer, and 3 days for me to send a rider to the northern mines and the railroad office to verify these ledgers. We will reconvene on Wednesday. This session is over. We will now proceed with the morning's hymn." He tapped the pulpit with his knuckle, a makeshift gavel. The legal proceeding was finished. The tension in the room, however, had only ratcheted tighter. It was a victory for Thayer. He had bought himself time and had turned the law, in its blindness, into his weapon. Elias felt a cold despair settle in his stomach. 3 days. It was an impossible deadline. He could not sell his cattle in 3 days. He could not conjure money from the frozen ground. He felt the weight of his father's legacy, of his brother's memory, crushing him. He had failed. As the organist began to play a wheezing introduction to a hymn, Elias and Nora turned from the altar. The whispers started almost immediately. They were quiet, vicious things that slithered through the pews. The phrase "warm bed" was passed from mouth to mouth, now laced with a new, cruel implication. She was the price of his recklessness. Her reputation was being shredded right there, on the steps of the altar. Nora heard it. Of course she heard it. She felt the sting of the words, the heat of the stares. For a moment her composure threatened to crack, but then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met the gaze of a woman in the second pew, a woman whose mouth was still twisted in a smirk. Nora's eyes were clear and cold, utterly without fear. The woman's smirk faltered, and she looked away, suddenly intensely interested in her hymn book. Elias saw it all. He saw the courage in Nora, and he saw the ugliness of his neighbors. He felt a surge of shame so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had dragged her into this. His fight had become her disgrace. He caught her eye, and in that single look, he tried to pour every ounce of his regret, his apology. "I am sorry." She saw his silent plea. Her response was not words. As they walked down the aisle, their arms brushed. She let her hand, for the briefest of moments, press against his. It was a short, firm touch, a touch that said, "We are in this together. Do not flinch. Do not break." The gesture was so small as to be invisible to anyone else, but for Elias, it was an anchor in a swirling sea of failure. They pushed open the heavy church doors and stepped outside into the biting wind. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of gray. The wind howled around the corners of the church, a lonely, desolate sound. From the belfry above, the iron church bell, rocked by the gale, began to swing. It did not ring, but made a dull, clanging noise. The sound of cold metal on cold metal. It was a toll for the dying hope within him. Back inside the church, as the congregation rose to sing, Thayer leaned over to the man sitting beside him, a hard-faced individual Elias recognized as one of the men from the bridge who had gotten away. Thayer's pleasant smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, reptilian fury. His voice was a low whisper, lost in the music. "Tonight," he hissed. "No more games. Make them feel a real cold." Elias and Nora walked away from the church, their boots crunching on the frozen path. They did not speak. There were no words for the defeat they had just suffered, for the impossible task that lay ahead. But as they walked, a subtle change occurred. The small, careful distance they had always maintained between them vanished. Without conscious thought, they moved closer together, their shoulders nearly touching, a shared bulwark against the wind. The space between them was now less than half a hand's breadth, a silent, unspoken alliance forged in the cold sanctuary of a frontier courthouse. They were two people walking away from a judgment, but they were walking as one. The silence in the ranch house was a fragile thing. Outside, the wind had risen again, not with the low moan of the previous nights, but with a high, keening shriek. It scoured the walls, searching for a way in, a hungry predator of a wind. Inside, by the flickering light of the stone hearth, there was a small circle of warmth and quiet industry. Nora knelt before the fire, her face flushed from the heat. She had taken 2 large and flat bricks from the side of the hearth and placed them directly on the embers. Now, using a pair of iron tongs, she carefully lifted one out. It glowed with a dull, internal heat. She had found a length of thick flannel, a remnant from an old shirt, and she wrapped the brick in it, her movements deft and practiced. This was a piece of frontier ingenuity, a secret passed between women in a land where the cold was a constant enemy. A bed warmer, a simple, heavy rectangle of stored sunshine to be placed at the foot of a cold bed. A small mercy against the long, freezing night. Elias sat at the table, a cup of coffee held loosely in his hands, watching her. He had not spoken much since they had returned from the church. The weight of the judge's impossible deadline pressed down on him, a physical thing that stooped his shoulders and shadowed his eyes. He had spent the afternoon reinforcing the fence on the north side of the pasture, a pointless, physical task to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on the inevitable. Selling off the herd, selling off his father's dream, piece by piece. He watched Nora wrap the second brick. She used the woolen scarf she had given him the night of the fire, the one he had returned to her that morning. The sight of it, the simple domestic act of her wrapping a hot brick in the same piece of wool that had covered his scarred hand, caused a strange tightening in his chest. In the space of a few days, this woman had woven herself into the fabric of his life, a thread of quiet strength and unexpected warmth. He was used to the cold. He was not used to this. Nora carried the 2 wrapped bricks into the small room that had been hers since she arrived. She tucked one deep under the blankets of her own narrow cot, and then she hesitated. She came back out and walked over to the ladder that led to the loft where Elias slept. Without a word, she climbed up into the darkness. He heard her moving about, the soft rustle of the straw mattress, and then she climbed back down. She had placed the other warmer in his bed. The gesture was so simple, so unasked for, that it left him without words. It was an act of pure, uncomplicated care. In a world that had offered him nothing but suspicion and hardship, it felt like a miracle. He was about to say something, to thank her, when he felt it. A change in the wind's song, a deeper vibration in the timbers of the house. He stood up and went to the window. Rubbing a clear patch on the frosted pane, the storm had entered a new, more violent phase. It was no longer just snow. It was a blizzard of fine, white powder. A blinding, disorienting curtain that erased the world. The familiar shapes of the barn and the fences were gone, swallowed by the swirling chaos. His lantern, hanging from a post by the barn door, was a tiny, fuzzy point of light, a lost star in a sea of white. A deep, instinctual unease settled over him. He knew his cattle. They were hardy, bred for this climate. They would huddle together on the lee side of the barn, their backs to the wind. But this storm felt different. It felt malevolent. "I need to check the herd," he said, his voice low. He was already pulling on his heavy coat, the one Nora had mended after the knife attack at the bridge. Nora came to stand beside him at the window. "You will be blinded out there," she said, her voice tight with concern. He just shook his head and pulled his hat down low. He took his lantern from its hook by the door, the glass cold to the touch. He stepped outside, and the storm immediately consumed him. The wind tore the breath from his lungs, and the powdered snow stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles. He was an island in a raging white ocean. He had taken no more than 10 steps toward the barn when a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was a sound that did not belong, the frantic, discordant clanging of a cowbell, shaken not by the movement of an animal, but by the hand of a man. It was coming from the far side of the pasture, a deliberate, malicious noise designed to sow terror. The effect on the herd was instantaneous and devastating. The cattle, already on edge from the storm, exploded in a panic. A low rumble turned into a thundering roar as hundreds of heavy bodies began to move as one. They were not just running, they were stampeding. A blind, unstoppable wave of fear. And they were running in the one direction Elias dreaded, toward the northern fence line, which bordered a deep, ice-choked gully. Elias forgot the cold, forgot the wind. He ran, his boots sinking deep in the snow, his lantern swinging wildly. He reached the barn, threw open the door, and unlatched the stall of his horse. Amos. There was no time for a saddle. He grabbed a bridle, slipped it over the horse's head, and swung himself onto its bare back. He burst out of the barn and rode directly into the teeth of the chaos. He could just make out the dark, surging mass of the herd through the swirling snow. He urged Amos on, the horse's powerful legs churning through the drifts. He rode parallel to the stampede, his only hope to get ahead of the lead animals, to turn them back toward the relative safety of the barn. He uncoiled the thick rope from his shoulder, the lariat that was as much a part of him as his own arm, and began to swing it, its crack as sharp as a rifle shot. He yelled until his throat was raw, his voice swallowed by the storm and the thunder of 1,000 hooves. Back at the house, Nora had seen it all from the window. She saw the dark wave of cattle. She saw Elias ride out, a lone, heroic figure against the tide. She knew she could not stand by. She pulled on her own coat and boots, wrapped a scarf over her nose and mouth, and ran outside. The force of the wind almost knocked her off her feet. She could do little against the main herd, but her mind, quick and practical, latched onto a different problem: the calves. In a stampede, the youngest and weakest were always the most vulnerable. likely to be separated and trampled. She remembered seeing an old iron whistle hanging by the hearth, one Elias used to call his dog. She ran back inside, grabbed it, and plunged back into the storm. She put the whistle to her lips and blew with all her might. A high, piercing shriek cut through the blizzard's howl. It was a sound the calves knew, a signal for feeding, for safety. She blew again and again, moving toward the edge of the stampede, her small figure a beacon of defiant order in the midst of pandemonium. A few of the younger animals, their eyes wide with terror, heard the familiar sound and instinctively began to break away from the main herd, turning toward her. Elias was losing the battle. The lead animals were too crazed with fear. They reached the northern fence line. It was not a proper fence of wood and wire, but a natural barrier, a deep drift of snow that had been packed hard by the wind and frozen solid, forming a treacherous wall of ice above the gully. The weight of the herd slammed into it. For a moment, it held. Then, with a sound like cracking thunder that was audible even over the storm, the ice fence gave way. A young calf, one of the ones Nora had been trying to call back, was pushed over the edge by the surge from behind. It tumbled down the short, steep incline and landed in the gully. Its leg twisted beneath it at an unnatural angle. It let out a piteous, terrified cry. Nora saw it fall. Without a second's hesitation, she began to make her way toward the gully. The ground was a treacherous slope of broken ice and deep snow. She got down on her hands and knees and began to crawl, the sharp edges of the ice tearing at her clothes and hands. She reached the calf. It was struggling, its eyes rolling in terror. Elias, having seen the breach, was riding back along the gully's edge. He saw Nora down with the calf. He saw something else, too, a flicker of movement in the darkness, beyond the main herd. A man on a horse, a faint silhouette against the snow. Nora knew the calf's leg was broken. She could not lift it. She pulled a length of rope she had grabbed from a hook by the door and, working quickly, fashioned a loop around the animal's horns, her fingers numb and clumsy in the freezing cold. She looked up, ready to call to Elias for help. A shot rang out, impossibly loud. The muzzle flash was a bright, angry flower blooming in the darkness. The bullet was not aimed at the calf. It was aimed at her. Elias had seen the rifle raised. He spurred Amos, and in the second it took for the bullet to cross the distance. He threw his horse and himself between Nora and the unseen gunman. He felt a violent impact as the bullet, instead of finding Nora, slammed into the ice-covered bank just beside them. A shower of ice shards and freezing water exploded into the air, peppering their faces. The shock of the cold water was like a slap, a brutal awakening. Elias slid from his horse's back and down the slope, landing beside Nora and the calf. The gunman, his work presumably done, melted back into the blizzard. "We have to get it out now," Elias yelled. He grabbed the other end of the rope Nora had tied. Together, they pulled. The calf cried out in pain, but they gritted their teeth and hauled, their boots slipping on the slick ice, their muscles straining. For a long, agonizing minute, the calf did not move. Then, slowly, inch by painful inch, they dragged it up the slippery bank and onto level ground. They stood over it, gasping for air, their bodies soaked and steaming in the frigid air. The adrenaline that had fueled them began to ebb, and the cold, the terrible, life-stealing cold, descended. Nora began to shiver. A small tremor at first, then a violent, uncontrollable shaking that racked her entire body. Her teeth chattered. Elias moved to her side. He put his arm around her, pulling her tight against him, sharing the heat of his own body. He could feel the violent tremors shaking her. He put his other hand on the back of her head, pressing her face against his shoulder, sheltering her from the wind. He was no longer just a rancher saving his herd. He was a man shielding a life. Slowly, leading the injured calf, they made their way back to the relative warmth of the barn. He settled the calf in a pen with fresh straw, then turned his attention to Nora. He led her back to the house, his arm never leaving her shoulders. Inside, the fire still burned brightly. The small room was an impossible sanctuary of warmth and light. Nora was shivering so hard she could barely stand. He sat her down in the chair by the hearth and began to strip off her wet outer layers, his movements rough but efficient. He wrapped her in the driest, warmest blankets he could find. Her skin was deathly pale, her lips tinged with blue. He looked at her, a fierce, protective feeling rising in him, so powerful it almost choked him. Then he remembered. He walked into her small room. He reached under the covers of her bed and pulled out the flannel-wrapped brick. It was still wonderfully, blessedly warm. He brought it to her, placing it in her lap, and began to chafe her frozen hands. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivers began to subside. A little color returned to her cheeks. She looked up at him, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and a faint, weary smile touched her lips. "I kept my word," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound. The bed was warm. She had kept her promise. Elias knelt before her, his soaked clothes dripping onto the floor, his face grim with the night's events. He looked at her, this impossible woman who had faced down gossip, fire, and bullets, all for a fight that was not hers. "Next time," he said, his voice raw and thick with an emotion he could not name, "it is my turn." He did not go to the loft to his own warm bed that night. After Nora was safely asleep, tucked under a mountain of blankets, he added more wood to the fire until it was a roaring blaze. He sat in the chair beside it, his grandfather's rifle across his lap, and kept watch. He sat there all through the long, dark hours, a solitary guardian, keeping the fire going, holding back the cold, a silent promise against the coming dawn. The dawn that followed the blizzard was unnaturally bright and still. The world outside the ranch house was a pristine expanse of white under a pale blue sky, the violence of the night erased by a blanket of fresh snow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of melting icicles from the eaves. Inside, the house was a pocket of weary warmth. Elias had finally succumbed to exhaustion in the early hours, slumping into a deep sleep in the chair by the hearth, the rifle resting against his knees. Nora, moving stiffly, had covered him with a blanket. She tended to the injured calf in the barn, her movements slow and deliberate, before preparing a pot of strong coffee and a pan of cornbread. There were only 2 days left. The quiet of the morning was not peace. It was the ticking of a clock. After they had eaten, a silent meal heavy with unspoken anxieties, Nora made a decision. The satchel of fraudulent receipts was their only weapon, but it was not enough. Judge Avery needed verification, something more than their word against Thayer's. The answer, she knew, was not at the ranch. It was in town, at the one place Thayer's business connected to the outside world. She rode to town alone. Elias needed to stay, to tend to the scattered herd and guard the ranch. Willow Flats was quiet, the residents digging themselves out from the storm. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of shovels scraping against wood and earth was the only sign of life. She avoided the main street, guiding her horse to the small, snowbound train station at the edge of town. A single set of tracks, gleaming in the morning sun, ran east and west, a thin iron artery connecting their isolated world to everything else. The station office was a small, cold room that smelled of telegraph oil, coal smoke, and damp paper. A lone agent, a man named Silas Croft with a thin mustache and nervous, darting eyes, sat behind a tall wooden desk, scratching away in a large ledger. He looked up as Nora entered, his expression wary. In a town this small, her association with Elias Boone was now common and controversial knowledge. "Good morning, Mr. Croft," Nora said, her voice calm and pleasant. "I am here about a delivery. I was expecting a package on the last freight train before the storm. I was wondering if you could check your manifest." Croft's eyes shifted away from hers. "The last freight was 2 days ago," Ma'am, Storm held it up. What was the package? School supplies. She lied smoothly. From a supplier back east. I just want to be sure it was not offloaded by mistake. Perhaps you could let me see the freight ledger for that day. His nervousness increased. He licked his lips, his gaze flicking toward the window that overlooked the platform. The ledgers are for official railroad business only, he stammered. I cannot just show them to anyone. Nora leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. This is about the coal shipment that was supposedly on that train, the one signed for by Thayer and Company. She was gambling, but the receipts in the satchel gave her the confidence. Croft's face went pale. He looked as though she had accused him of a murder. I do not know anything about that, he said, his voice barely audible. I just log what comes through. Nora's gaze was steady, not unkind, but insistent. I know Thayer is pressuring people. Mr. Croft. But Elias Boone is an honest man being squeezed out of his land by a lie? All I need to see is the entry for that coal car. He hesitated, a man caught between two fears. The fear of Colton Thayer was immediate and tangible, but the quiet, unyielding integrity in Nora's eyes presented a different kind of pressure. He looked around the empty station, then made his decision. He pulled another, smaller ledger from under his desk. He opened it and pushed it across the counter, his finger pointing to a single entry. It came through, he whispered, his voice trembling. A whole car of lump coal from the northern mines. But the freight bill was marked unpaid. An error. They said, Thayer's assistant, a man named Miller, came down, said Thayer would settle it directly with the company. He signed for it as lost freight, took the whole car. It never officially arrived. There it was, the linchpin of the fraud. A ghost shipment, signed for by Thayer's man, that existed only on the phantom receipts used to inflate Elias's debt. Who signed for it, Nora asked. Miller, Croft repeated. He signed the release. Then he tore the page out of the main manifest. This here is my private log. I write everything down, just in case. He tapped the book, a small act of defiance. As Nora was about to thank him, the office door opened, letting in a swirl of cold air. A man stepped inside who was clearly not from Willow Flats. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a practical but well-made city coat. His face was clean-shaven, and his eyes were a sharp, intelligent gray. They swept the room, taking in Nora, the nervous station agent, and the open ledger between them in a single, comprehensive glance. Silas Croft, the stranger said, his voice a low baritone. My name is Agent Reed. I am with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I am here to investigate the theft of railroad property, specifically 300 timber cross ties. Croft looked as if he were about to faint. Nora, however, felt a jolt of an entirely different emotion. It was hope. She saw a connection, a new piece of the puzzle falling into place. Agent Reed, she said, stepping forward. My name is Nora Dale. I believe the men you are looking for and the men we are looking for might be one and the same. She noticed the reddish dust on the floor mat, a faint trace left by the boots of 100 men, but distinct around the stove where the station agent sat. She pointed to it. Does that dust mean anything to you? Reed looked down, his sharp eyes narrowing. He knelt and rubbed a bit of the dust between his thumb and forefinger. Red coal dust. He said, from the old northern pits. We have found traces of it at the sites where the ties were stolen further down the line. We believe the thieves are using the abandoned mine as their base of operations. Why do you ask? Nora told him everything. She spoke quietly, laying out the facts with the precision of a surgeon. The short-weighted coal, the slashed hay bales, the fire, the attack at the bridge. She told him about the ghost shipment of coal and the ledger hidden under the counter. While Nora was forging an unexpected alliance at the train station, Elias was conducting his own quiet investigation at the ranch. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the captured satchel open before him. He pushed the fraudulent receipts to one side, his focus on a single, heavy object he had taken from his father's desk drawer. It was the Boone family seal, the one he had gripped in his hand when Thayer had made his insulting offer. It was a simple, heavy piece of brass, its wooden handle worn smooth by the hands of his father and grandfather. He took one of the fake receipts and held it next to the seal. At first glance, the stamped impression on the paper looked perfect, a bold, capital B inside a simple circle. But Elias knew the truth was in the details. He ran his thumb over the face of the brass seal. He knew its surface better than he knew his own reflection. He had stared at it for hours as a boy, fascinated by its sense of history, of permanence. His father had told him the story. His great-grandfather, a blacksmith, had forged the seal himself, and in the process, while striking the hot metal, a tiny piece had chipped away, creating a hairline fracture in the crossbar of the B. It was a flaw, an imperfection, but it had become their mark. The broken line was their history, a symbol of a family that had been bent but never broken. He held the paper up to the light streaming in through the window. He squinted, his eyes tracing the lines of the ink, and he saw it, or rather, he saw what was not there. The B on the fraudulent receipt was perfect. The crossbar was a solid, unbroken line. It was a forgery, a clever one, but a fake nonetheless. It was a copy made by a man who did not know the story, who did not know the meaning of the flaw. A slow, cold anger built in him. This was not just a theft of land and cattle, it was a theft of his name, his history. Thayer had not just tried to ruin him, he had tried to erase him. When Nora returned to the ranch, she found him sitting there, the real seal in one hand, the false receipt in the other. She brought with her Agent Reed, the Pinkerton. The three of them stood around the table, the pieces of the puzzle laid out between them, the short-weighted coal, the red dust, the ghost shipment, the forged seal, the slashed hay in the fire, the stolen cross ties. It was all one story, a web of corruption with Colton Thayer sitting at its center. It is a strong case, Reed admitted, his professional skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before him. The forgery is clear, the fraud at the station is damning, but Thayer is a slippery man. He will claim his assistant acted alone. He will bury us in paperwork and legal maneuvers until your deadline has passed and he owns this ranch. To make it stick, to get a conviction that will put him away. I need more. I need a witness, someone from inside that mine. A witness. The word hung in the air, a seemingly impossible requirement. Thayer's men were thugs and criminals, not men who would testify against their paymaster. It felt like another dead end. Just then, the door to the ranch house creaked open. It was Cal, one of Nora's brightest pupils, a small, shy boy of about 8. He held his hat in his hands, his eyes wide. "Ma'am," he said timidly, looking at Nora. "My pa sent me. He heard what happened at the church. He said to give you this." He held out a folded, messy piece of paper. Nora took it gently. "What is it, Cal?" "My pa. He used to work at the Northern Mine, before Mr. Thayer bought it and fired everyone," the boy explained, his words coming in a rush. "He said Mr. Thayer is using the old tunnels, the ones that are not on the official maps. He said he used to talk about it all the time, how to get in and out without using the main entrance. Pa cannot read or write, but I can. I listened to his stories. I drew you a map. Nora unfolded the paper. On it was a child's drawing, rendered in charcoal from the fire. It was a crude, simple map, showing the main mine entrance, a series of hills, and a creek. But on the far side of a ridge, marked with a child's unsteady X, was another entrance, labeled the Bear's Mouth, a name Cal had likely heard in his father's tales. It was a back door. Agent Reed looked at the map, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, I will be," he said softly. The boy, Cal, had given them the key. He had given them a way in. That evening, as a cold twilight settled over the snow, The plan was made. Reed would ride to the next county to telegraph his office for reinforcements and to arrange for a federal marshal, but that would take time. More time than the single day Elias had left. The evidence they needed, the proof that would link Thayer directly to the stolen goods and the criminal operation, was inside that mine. And they were the only ones who could get it tonight. Nora took the boy's map and folded it carefully. She unwound her woolen scarf, the one that had warmed bricks and covered scars, and tucked the map deep within its folds, pinning it securely. It was a promise to the boy, a safekeeping of his courage. Elias stood by the door, pulling on his heavy coat. He checked his pistol, the one he had retrieved from the snow by the broken bridge, and slid it into a holster concealed beneath his arm. His face was grim, his eyes hard as winter stone. They were no longer just defending the ranch. They were hunting. They would go in tonight, under the cover of darkness, through the bear's mouth. The final answer, the final piece of proof, lay somewhere under a mountain of rock and red-stained ice. The journey to the northern hills was a pilgrimage into a deeper cold. They followed the crude map drawn by the hand of a child, a fragile guide through a landscape of silent, snow-shrouded monoliths. The moon was a chip of bone in the black sky, its light too thin to offer real warmth, but it was enough to turn the snow to a sea of shimmering silver. They left the horses tethered in a deep, sheltered ravine and proceeded on foot, their breath pluming and freezing in the still, razor-sharp air. Elias led the way, his long strides eating up the ground, his pistol a cold, heavy weight under his coat. Nora followed, her steps lighter but just as determined, the precious map a warm secret tucked inside her scarf. Cal's drawing was surprisingly accurate. After a difficult climb up a steep, wooded ridge, they found it, the bear's mouth. It was not a man-made entrance, but a natural fissure in the rock face, a jagged black crack partially obscured by a curtain of long, wicked-looking icicles. The wind moaned softly at its entrance, a low, mournful sound, as if the mountain itself were breathing. The way was barred. A heavy iron gate, thick with rust and frost, had been wedged into the opening and secured with a massive chain and a heavy padlock. It was a crude but effective barrier. "Stand back and shield the light," Elias whispered. Nora nodded, cupping her hands around the glass chimney of their single hurricane lamp. She held it low to the ground, creating a small, intimate circle of light that pushed back against an immense, devouring darkness. The small flame was their only eye in the gloom, and she guarded it as if it were life itself. Elias took a heavy-duty chisel and a small sledgehammer from the canvas bag he carried. He wedged the tip of the chisel into a link of the chain, the metal biting with a sharp, grating sound. He raised the hammer. The first blow was not loud, but the sharp, metallic clink echoed in the profound silence of the hills. It sounded like a bone breaking. Elias froze, every muscle tensed, listening. The only answer was the sigh of the wind. He struck again, and again. The rhythmic, percussive sounds were a small, desperate drumbeat against the vast, silent night. Each strike sent a jarring shock up his arms. Nora watched, her heart pounding in time with the hammer blows. Finally, with a sharp crack that was loud as a gunshot in the stillness, the link broke. The chain fell away with a heavy clatter. He pushed the gate. It groaned in protest, its rusty hinges scraping against the rock. They slipped inside. The air in the tunnel was different, colder and heavy with the smell of damp earth, wet stone, and the faint, acrid tang of coal dust. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to press in on them, to swallow the small light of their lamp whole. They followed a narrow, descending passage. The ground was uneven, littered with loose rock. After 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, a man-made cavern supported by thick timber beams. A set of rusty iron rails ran across the floor, disappearing into a black tunnel on the far side. Stacked against one wall were dozens of stolen railroad cross ties, the raw, cut ends of the wood a pale yellow in the lamplight. Agent Reed's missing property. In a small alcove carved into the rock was a crude desk and a stool. On it, their jackpot lay waiting, a stack of ledgers, a bottle of black ink and a pen, and resting on a smudged ink pad, as if left in a hurry, was the forged seal. The perfect, unbroken B. It was the tool of the crime, left in plain sight. Nora picked up one of the ledgers, her gloved fingers tracing the columns of numbers. "Here," she whispered, her voice a hushed, excited breath. She pointed to a page. Elias leaned closer, the lamplight falling on the numbers. He could see the original, smaller figures for coal shipments, scratched out and overwritten with much larger amounts. It was brazen, arrogant fraud. He moved the lamp, its light sweeping across the chamber. It fell upon another stack of supplies, sacks of rock oil, the same kind that had been used to start the fire at his shed, and slapped onto the front of each burlap sack was a paper label, a shipping tag from Thayer's bank. The link was no longer circumstantial. It was direct, irrefutable. Thayer had not just financed this operation. He had supplied it. It was then that they heard it. A distant sound, faint but unmistakable. The crunch of many horses' hooves on crisp snow. It was coming from the direction of the main mine entrance. On the other side of the hill, they were coming back. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Nora. They were trapped. The evidence was in their hands, but they were deep inside the mountain, with the enemy closing in. "There has to be another way out," Elias said, his voice a low, urgent growl. He grabbed a heavy canvas sack and began stuffing it with the evidence, a ledger, a handful of the forged receipts, the fake seal itself. Every second was precious. The sound of the horses grew louder, now joined by the low murmur of men's voices. He scanned the cavern, his eyes desperate. There, a narrow ventilation shaft, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, climbed steeply up one wall. It was a dark, uninviting hole, but it led up, toward the open air. It was their only chance. "Go," he said, pushing Nora toward the opening. "I am right behind you." The shaft was a rough, vertical chimney of rock, with just enough handholds and footholds to make a treacherous ascent possible. It was a climb made in near total darkness, Elias holding the lamp below them, its light casting their struggling shadows, long and distorted, on the jagged walls above. They climbed, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming, the sound of men entering the main cavern below them, their voices echoing up the shaft, spurred them on. They emerged into the freezing night air, high up on the side of the hill, gasping, their chests heaving. They were not safe. They were exposed, on a wide, steep slope of ice and scree that fell away into a dark, wooded ravine below. The moonlight turned the ice into a treacherous, glittering mirror. They began to run, a desperate, stumbling flight across the slick, uneven ground. Below them, they saw the lights of lanterns bobbing as Thayer's men fanned out from the main entrance, searching. A shout went up. They had been spotted. The chase was a nightmare of slipping feet and burning lungs. The slope was a minefield of black ice hidden under thin dustings of snow. Their boots could find no purchase. They used their hands, grabbing at the frozen roots of stunted pine trees that clung to the hillside. The air was thin and cold, each breath a painful stab. Nora's foot slipped. The world tilted sideways. One moment she was running, the next she was falling, sliding uncontrollably down the slick, icy surface. She cried out, a sharp, terrified sound. She clawed at the ice, but there was nothing to hold on to. She was sliding faster and faster, a helpless projectile aimed at the black, rocky edge of the ravine 100 feet below. Elias saw her fall. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. He did not think. He reacted. He threw himself forward, launching his body down the slope in a desperate, sliding dive. He hit the ice hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body. But his eyes were locked on her, on the dark shape of her disappearing down the hill. He stretched out his hand. his fingers grasping, closing on empty air. He pushed off with his feet, gaining a little speed. He was closing the distance. One last, desperate lunge. His fingers closed around the thick leather of her belt. The jolt nearly tore his arm from its socket. Her momentum pulled him with her, and for a horrifying second, he thought they would both go over the edge. He dug the heels of his boots into the ice, gritting his teeth, his muscles screaming in protest. They stopped, a mere 10 feet from the precipice, a sheer drop into blackness. They lay there, panting, tethered together by his single, desperate grip. "Look at me," he roared, his voice a raw, ragged command that cut through her panic. She twisted her head, her face pale with terror in the moonlight, her eyes wide. He held her gaze, forcing her to focus on him, to draw strength from him. "I have got you," he said, his voice softer now, but still firm. "We are going to get up. On my count. 3. He pulled. She kicked, scrabbling for a foothold. They moved together, a single unit of straining muscle and sheer will. They slid back an inch, then gained 2. He wrapped his other arm around her, and together they crawled, inch by agonizing inch, away from the edge, back up the treacherous slope until they reached the relative safety of a small cluster of pine trees. They collapsed in the snow, their bodies trembling, their breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. They could hear the shouts of their pursuers below. Closer now. They were climbing the slope, their lanterns moving steadily upward. "The evidence," Nora gasped, clutching the canvas sack. They could not outrun them, not carrying the heavy sack. Elias looked around wildly. Near their small cluster of trees was a large, heavy mining tarp, frozen stiff, likely used to cover equipment in the summer. An idea sparked. He grabbed the sack, shoved it deep under the tarp, and then they both began frantically piling snow over it, trying to make it look like just another snowdrift. They were just finishing when a figure appeared over a nearby rise, moving faster than the others. A big man, silhouetted against the moon. He saw them. He raised his rifle. There was no time to run. Nora was closest to a long-handled shovel that had been left leaning against a tree. She did not hesitate. She grabbed it, and with a guttural cry that was part fear and part fury, she swung it like a baseball bat. The heavy iron scoop connected with the man's knees with a sickening crunch. He howled in pain and surprise, his rifle shot going wild, and staggered. The man was stunned, but not down. He lunged for her, his face a mask of rage, but Elias was already there. He did not fire his pistol. A shot would bring the others in seconds. He moved in close, and with a short, brutal motion, he brought the heavy barrel of the gun down on the side of the man's head. The sound was a dull, ugly thud. The man crumpled without another sound and lay still in the snow. A moment of shocked, ringing silence followed the brief, violent encounter. And then, a new sound began. From the valley below, the deep, resonant clang of the mine's warning bell began to ring out, a frantic, insistent alarm. One of the other men, hearing the wild rifle shot, must have sounded it. The loud, metallic peals rolled up the hillside, a frantic, brazen announcement of their intrusion. The sound washed over the frozen landscape, a clangorous, iron-tongued accusation. And as the bell tolled, the snow, which had been falling in a light, steady whisper, seemed to stop for a single, held breath. The air was utterly still, as if the mountain, the sky, and the night itself had paused to listen. The church was colder than it had been 3 days prior, but it was a different kind of cold. It was not the seeping chill of the blizzard, but the brittle, silent cold of judgment. The pews were packed, not a single space left empty. Every resident of Willow Flats and the surrounding homesteads was there, their face tight with anticipation. This was no longer just about Elias Boone's death. It had become a reckoning for the town itself. They had come to see a verdict rendered, not just on a man, but on the soul of their community. Elias and Nora sat in the front pew, a small island of stillness in a sea of restless whispers. The deadline had arrived. They had returned from the mine just before dawn, exhausted, bruised, but carrying the heavy weight of their proof. They had handed the canvas sack to Agent Reed, who had met them at the edge of town, and then they had simply waited. At the pulpit, Reverend Judge Avery looked grim, the weight of his dual responsibilities heavy on his face. In front of him, at a small table he had set up, sat Colton Thayer. Thayer appeared as calm and composed as ever, his fine wool suit immaculate, a look of mild irritation on his face, as if the proceedings were a tedious formality. He had brought his assistant, Miller, who sat beside him looking pale and nervous. Thayer had spent the last 2 days spreading his own version of events, painting Elias as a violent, unstable man who had concocted a wild story to evade an honest debt. Judge Avery cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed sanctuary. "We are reconvened to conclude the matter between Elias Boone and Colton Thayer. Mr. Boone, your 3 days are expired. Are you prepared to settle your debt?" Before Elias could answer, the great oak doors at the back of the church swung open with a resounding boom. Every head turned. Agent Reed stood silhouetted against the bright morning light. He was not alone. Behind him stood 2 hard-faced men with badges pinned to their coats, and between them, looking terrified but resolute, was Cal's father, a coal-streaked miner named Arthur. "This is not a civil matter any longer. Judge," Agent Reed announced, his voice ringing with an authority that superseded any local power. "This is a federal investigation." He strode down the aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. The entire church held in rapt silence. He walked to the altar and emptied the contents of the canvas sack onto its sacred surface. The ledger, the forged receipts, the fake metal seal, they lay there, a collection of mundane objects that formed an undeniable narrative of greed and corruption. "We have recovered ledgers from the northern mine proving systematic fraud," Reed declared, his voice hard as iron. "We have recovered this seal, a forgery used to create fraudulent invoices against the railroad. We have found stolen railroad property on Mr. Thayer's leased land, and," he said, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder, "we have a witness." Arthur stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the judge. "I worked that mine," he said, his voice rough but clear. I saw them alter the weight books. I saw them loading the stolen cross ties onto unmarked freight cars. Mr. Miller there, he was the one giving the orders, but the orders came from Mr. Thayer." A wave of murmurs swept through the congregation. The whispers were no longer about Elias and Nora. They were about Thayer, the tide of public opinion, so long a current of suspicion against the Boones, was beginning to turn. Thayer rose to his feet, his composure finally cracking, a mask of smooth confidence replaced by a sneer of pure venom. A witness, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You bring a disgruntled, fired laborer to testify against me. This is preposterous. This is a conspiracy, a fabrication cooked up by a desperate man and his whore." The ugly word hung in the sacred air of the church, a deliberate, brutal attack designed to poison the well, to discredit the evidence by defaming the character of the woman who had helped uncover it. He pointed a trembling finger at Nora. "This is all her doing. She came to this town with nothing and saw a lonely fool with a sizable piece of land. Do you really believe this pile of papers, or is it more likely that the warmth of the teacher's bed was the price for her testimony?" The crowd gasped. It was a vile, desperate gambit, an attempt to drag the proceedings into the muck of the very rumors he had helped create. Elias started to rise, a murderous rage contorting his face. But Nora put a hand on his arm, a gesture of restraint that was as firm as iron. She stood up, her movement not hurried or angry, but deliberate and imbued with a powerful, unshakable dignity. She faced Thayer, her eyes clear and unwavering. The church was so quiet that the sound of a single snowflake melting on the window pane would have been deafening. "You are right about one thing. Mr. Thayer, she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a clarity that cut through the silence. I am warm, but I am warm because we built a fire against the cold. I am warm because we hauled a frightened calf from a frozen ditch. I am warm because we work. She paused, letting her words sink in, then took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. You are warm because you steal the coal from another man's fire. It was a rebuttal and a condemnation all in one. She had taken his ugliest weapon, the story of the warm bed, and reforged it into a shield of integrity and a sword of truth. She had laid bare the two opposing forces in that room, in that town, the warmth of honest labor versus the false heat of stolen wealth. The silence that followed was broken by a single, solid sound. A farmer in the back pew, a man who had lost his own homestead to the bank a year earlier, stamped his foot on the floor. Then another man did, and another. A low, rumbling murmur of assent, of understanding, began to spread through the congregation. They were no longer idle spectators. They were witnesses, and they had seen the truth. Judge Avery's face was set like stone. He picked up a small wooden mallet from the pulpit, a tool he normally used for minor repairs around the church, and brought it down with a crack that silenced the room. The sound was a hammer blow of finality. This court recognizes the evidence presented by the Pinkerton Agency. A formal investigation into the business practices of Colton Thayer is hereby declared. By the authority vested in me by this territory, I am ordering the immediate seizure of the Thayer and Company warehouse and all its contents, pending that investigation. Then Elias stood up. He walked to the altar, his movements slow and reverent. He reached into his coat and pulled out his father's brass seal. He did not say a word. He simply placed it on the altar, next to the forgery. The light from the altar candles caught the surface of the metal, and for the first time, the whole town could see it. The tiny, hairline fracture in the crossbar of the B. It was a mark of imperfection, of hardship, of history. It was the unforgeable truth of a family's legacy, a story of endurance written in scarred metal. That was the moment Thayer finally broke. His face, a mask of pale, sweating fury, contorted. His hand darted inside his fine wool coat. He was reaching for a pistol, but he was too slow. Agent Reed moved with the speed of a striking snake, his own revolver appearing in his hand as if by magic. He brought his arm down, not to fire, but to slam the barrel of his gun onto Thayer's wrist. Thayer cried out in pain, and a small, silver-plated derringer clattered to the floor. But it was not just Reed who moved. In that instant, the men of Willow Flats, the same men who had whispered and joked in the saloon, rose as one from the pews. They did not rush forward. They simply stood. They formed a solid, silent line down the center aisle, a human wall between Colton Thayer and the rest of the community. It was a quiet, powerful, and unmistakable declaration. He was no longer one of them. He was an outsider, an infection they were now determined to purge. Outside, as if on cue, the world began to change. The heavy, oppressive gray clouds that had smothered the sky for days began to break apart. A single, brilliant shaft of sunlight pierced through a window, cutting through the dusty air of the church and illuminating the altar. In its light, the fine, suspended dust of the room and the swirling powder of snow just outside the glass danced and glittered like silver. The storm was over. The cold was breaking. Judge Avery's voice filled the new, hopeful light. The fraudulent winter fee on the Boone loan is hereby struck down as predatory and illegitimate. The original loan is extended until the spring thaw, when the cattle can be brought to market. He looked at Miller, Thayer's assistant, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. A warrant is issued for your arrest, Mr. Miller, for your role in this conspiracy. As for you, Mr. Thayer, he said, his eyes hard as nails, you are in the custody of the Pinkerton Agency. The two deputies moved in, and it was over. The great suffocating weight that had pressed down on the town, on the ranch, was lifted. There would be legal proceedings, trials, and testimonies. But the truth had finally come into the light, and it was blinding. In the quiet aftermath, as the crowd began to disperse, their voices now filled with relief and a renewed sense of community. Nora turned to Elias. He stood by the altar, his hand resting on his father's seal, his face a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and a slow, dawning peace. Their eyes met across the now empty space. There were no words that could contain the entirety of what they had been through, of what they had become to one another. She walked to him. He did not move. She stood before him, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other, their shared survival, their shared victory, a silent, powerful current between them. Then, slowly, she raised her hand to his face, her touch gentle. She leaned in, and he leaned down, and they rested their foreheads together. It was not a kiss. It was something more intimate, a quiet, breathless pressing of bone against bone, a long, silent sharing of warmth and relief. The cold had been broken, and in its place, a warmth that had been earned, a warmth that would last. The night was a deep, velvet silence. The wind, which had howled and raged for nearly a week, had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world scoured clean and a sky littered with cold, diamond-sharp stars. The journey back from town had been a quiet one, the crunch of the horses' hooves in the snow the only sound between them. It was not an awkward silence, but a shared space of exhaustion and profound, bone-deep relief. The land itself seemed different, the familiar contours of the hills and plains no longer menacing, but softened, resting under a blanket of new-fallen grace. Inside the ranch house, the fire in the hearth was the warm, beating heart of the world. It cast a flickering, golden light on the rough-hewn timbers and the simple, sturdy furniture. It was a small space, but for the first time since his brother's death, it felt like a home to Elias, not just a shelter. He watched as Nora knelt before the flames, her face serene in the firelight. She was performing the now familiar ritual of warming the bricks for their beds. The simple, domestic act had become laden with a new and powerful meaning. It was no longer just a practical chore to ward off the chill. It was a promise kept, a symbol of the sanctuary they had built together in the heart of the storm. She used the tongs to carefully lift a glowing brick from the embers, wrapping it in a thick piece of flannel. Her movements were unhurried, imbued with a quiet, peaceful purpose. While she tended to the bricks, Elias went outside. The cold was immediate and intense, but it was a clean cold now, without the biting teeth of the wind. He walked to the front of the house, to the place where the sign bearing his family's name hung. It had been knocked askew by the blizzard, hanging at a slight, defeated angle. It had been like that for days. A small, visible symbol of the precariousness of his hold on this land. He had not had the heart to fix it. He went to the barn and returned with a hammer and a handful of long, iron nails. He stood for a moment, looking at the weathered wood, the faded letters spelling out Boone Ranch. It was his name, his legacy. He took down the sign, brushed the snow from its surface, and then carefully, deliberately, hung it again. He made sure it was perfectly straight, perfectly level. Then he took a new nail, longer and thicker than the old ones, and drove it home with 3 solid, ringing blows of the hammer. The sound echoed in the vast, silent night, a declaration of permanence, of rebuilding. He drove 2 more nails in for good measure, anchoring the sign so firmly to the house that no storm could ever tear it loose again. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, Nora was waiting for him. The 2 warm bricks were already tucked away in their respective beds, one in her small cot, one in his loft. But she held something else in her hands. It was the woolen scarf, the one that had been a silent witness to so much of their story. She had washed it. The grime and soot from the fire were gone. In the firelight, he could see that she had also mended a small tear in the corner, her stitches small, neat, and impossibly strong. Then he saw what was new. Near the mended corner, she had embroidered a single word in thick, white thread. Warm. She held it out to him. It was not his scarf to begin with, but she gave it back to him now. Transformed. It was no longer just a piece of wool. It was a testament, a gift. He took it from her, the material soft and warm in his calloused hands. He ran his thumb over the embroidered word, over the neat, careful stitches. He felt a thickness in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold. He turned and walked to the stone mantelpiece above the hearth. It was the most important place in the house, the repository of the few things he truly valued. He picked up the heavy brass seal that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him, the seal with the flawed, imperfect B. He took the mended, embroidered scarf and folded it carefully. He laid it on the mantel, and then he placed the heavy brass seal on top of it, the cold, enduring metal resting on the soft, warm wool. The two objects sat there together, side by side in the firelight, the flawed history of his family and the promise of a new and different kind of warmth, a small emblem of their past and a quiet standard for their future. From outside, the quiet, rhythmic sound of the cattle chewing their cud in the barn drifted through the walls, a peaceful, reassuring cadence. One of the older cows shifted, and the sound of her brass bell, a single, clear, musical note, floated through the still night air. It was the sound of life, of contentment, of a ranch at peace. Nora came to stand beside him, her shoulder just brushing against his. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance and sway. "I will keep the bed warm," she said softly, her voice a quiet murmur that was almost part of the fire's crackle. It was her half of the bargain, the promise she had made in the heart of a blizzard, now renewed as a vow. Elias turned his head to look at her, at the firelight catching in her dark hair. "I will keep the wind out," he answered, his voice a low rumble. It was his half, the promise of work, of protection, of a steady hand against the harshness of the world. They looked at each other, and in that shared gaze, the two halves of their promise became a single, whole thing. "We will keep each other," Nora whispered. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He leaned down, and she rose to meet him. They kissed. It was not a kiss of sudden, desperate passion. There was no hurry, no fire, no storm. It was a slow, deep, and deliberate meeting, a quiet sealing of the vow they had just made. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, of cold air, of a long and difficult journey finally finding its end. It was a kiss that did not steal the breath, but instead seemed to restore it. A slow, steady warmth that started on their lips and spread gently through their chests. A quiet sunrise in the heart. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in the quiet of the house, the warmth of the fire, and the new unspoken certainty of what they had just begun. Tomorrow, the world would start again. There was a class of children to be taught in the granary. There were fences to be mended where the stampede had broken through. There was a final statement to be given to Agent Reed to close the case against Thayer forever. The work was endless. The winter was still long, but for the first time, the thought of the labor to come, of the cold months ahead, did not feel like a burden. It felt like a life. The cold had not been conquered, but it had been met. It now had an adversary, and in the heart of the vast, lonely plains, under the cold, distant stars, they each now had a place and a person to come home to. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow listeners. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider supporting us further by hitting the hype button. Your support helps these stories reach a wider audience.